The question, what does it mean to be human, has been addressed from multiple disciplines, and there is no single conclusive definition. Biologically, we belong to the species Homo sapiens, characterized by a highly developed nervous system, symbolic language, and the ability to create culture. However, these traits alone are not enough to understand the complexity of our condition. From a philosophical perspective, being human is not just an empirical fact, but an existential condition that requires self-awareness, moral responsibility, and the capacity to transcend. One of the earliest significant philosophical definitions comes from Aristotle, who described the human being as a rational animal, zoon logikon. This idea placed reason at the center of our nature, implying that humanity is fulfilled through logical thought, language, and political life. However, this conception has been challenged by modern and contemporary thinkers such as Nietzsche and Heidegger, who argued that rationality does not exhaust our lived experience. In fact, it often represses or distorts it. In psychology, especially within its humanistic branch, a more holistic view of the human being is proposed. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow argued that the essence of our humanity lies in self-actualization and the ability to experience authentic relationships. According to Maslow, once basic needs are met, motivation shifts toward transcendence and meaning. This implies that being human is not merely about survival, but also about building a coherent identity and seeking purpose. Historically, we see that the definition of human has been variable and often exclusionary. For centuries, women, slaves, indigenous people, or those with disabilities were considered less human by dominant ideological systems. This exclusion shows that the idea of humanity has been used as a tool of power. Hannah Arendt warned about this issue when analyzing how certain political regimes dehumanize others to justify violence, showing that the concept of the human can be instrumentalized. Sharing knowledge is a form of resistance against that historical manipulation. That's why it's vital to support and spread projects like this. If you find value in this kind of critical reflection, consider liking and subscribing. It's not about vanity, but about creating spaces where free and rigorous thinking can thrive. In a context where superficiality dominates communication channels, choosing depth becomes a necessary act. Returning to the analysis, modern philosophical anthropology has attempted to integrate the various aspects of the human condition: biological, symbolic, social, and spiritual. Max Scheler proposed that the human being is a spiritual animal, that is, a being open to the world, capable of guiding its actions by values not derived from natural impulses. This openness makes us unique, but also vulnerable to existential emptiness when we lose our symbolic references. In contemporary societies, the main risk appears to be dehumanization through automation. By becoming cogs in economic, educational, or digital systems, we risk reducing ourselves to operational functions. Jacques Ellul and Herbert Marcuse pointed out how modern technology tends to objectify the individual, denying their critical and creative dimension. In this sense, being human requires active resistance against processes that aim to standardize our subjectivity. A key question is, what distinguishes our mind from artificial intelligence? The answer lies not only in computational complexity, but in elements like intentionality, phenomenological consciousness, and historicity. John Searle and Thomas Metzinger have argued that human consciousness involves a sense of self that cannot be reduced to functional data. This self emerges from the interaction between body, language, and culture, and cannot be replicated through simulation. The process of individuation, as described by Carl Jung, is central to understanding what makes us human. Having a functional self is not enough. humanity involves developing toward the integration of the shadow, the unconscious, and archetypes. It is a dynamic, non-linear process that unfolds throughout life and is shaped by cultural and historical contexts. Therefore, being human also means becoming oneself in an ethical and symbolically meaningful way. Freedom is another key dimension. Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free. That is, we cannot escape the responsibility of choosing and defining ourselves. But this freedom can be a source of anguish, as Kierkegaard had already noted. That's why many people renounce their humanity by retreating into roles, dogmas, or systems that relieve them of decision-making. Alienation, in the Marxist sense, also operates here. The subject loses contact with their essence by living according to structures they do not control. Historically speaking, modernity brought a radical break with traditional views of the human being. The Cartesian cogito displaced God as the foundation of truth, placing the rational subject at the center. However, this also created a crisis of meaning. By severing ties with sacred and communal narratives, the modern individual was left exposed to loneliness and nihilism. This void still affects us in the 21st century, worsened by hyperconnectivity and the constant consumption of stimuli. We can say that being human is not a fixed condition, but a continuous construction. Ernst Cassirer proposed that the human being is a symbolic animal, capable of creating and inhabiting cultural worlds. This capacity allows us to reinvent ourselves, but also to drift away from empirical reality. In this sense, our humanity is in permanent tension between what we are biologically and what we symbolically project onto the world. From neuroscience, we know that much of our decision-making occurs unconsciously. This challenges the idea of a fully autonomous self. However, what makes us human is precisely the ability to reflect on those impulses and redirect them. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for abstract thought and emotional regulation, has been key to our evolution. Its development enabled us not only to adapt, but also to transform our environment and ourselves. Empathy is another essential trait. It's not just about feeling what others feel, but about understanding their perspective and acting morally in response. Martin Hoffman distinguished between cognitive empathy and affective empathy and showed how this ability is one of the foundations of pro-social behavior. Without empathy, there is no community. Without community, there is no culture. And without culture, there is no humanity as we know it. On an ethical level, being human means recognizing the inherent dignity of all other human beings. This idea, central to Kantian philosophy, has been enshrined in modern human rights. But in reality, such recognition is not automatic. It requires education, dialogue, and critical reflection. Hannah Arendt reminded us that radical evil often doesn't stem from hatred, but from banality, from not thinking, from obeying without questioning. Today's production systems tend to reward efficiency over contemplation, productivity over depth. This has created a culture of exhaustion and performance. Byung-Chul Han describes it as the society of fatigue, where the individual exploits themselves under the illusion of self-fulfillment. In this environment, humanity becomes hollow, reduced to a profile, an algorithm, a managed image. That's why philosophical thinking is not a luxury, but a necessity. To think critically is an act of humanity, not to arrive at absolute answers, but to keep open the possibility of better understanding ourselves. As Gadamer would say, dialogue is the privileged path to truth. And that dialogue is not only between people, but also with tradition, with history, and with our contradictions. The human condition is fragile, but its value lies precisely in that fragility. We are neither invulnerable nor self-sufficient. We depend on language, on relationships, on collective memory. We are finite beings who sense the infinite, and this tension gives rise to both creativity and anxiety. The great works of the human spirit, science, art, ethics, are attempts to respond to that paradox at the heart of our existence. Are we truly human when we ignore the suffering of others, when we allow exclusion, when we normalize inequality? If humanity is defined by the capacity to reflect and act with awareness, then every omission matters. Being human also means exercising judgment, accepting consequences, resisting indifference. It is not a given essence, but a constructed ethic. In short, being human is not simply to be, but to become. It involves self-awareness, historicity, responsibility, and symbolic projection. We cannot be reduced to what we do or feel, but we also cannot ignore. We are an open synthesis of nature and culture, of necessity and freedom. The truth of our existence is not in a closed concept, but in the ongoing effort to understand and humanize ourselves in every context.